Man saved dying pregnant wolf. Months later, the whole pack does something incredible. In the heart of the wild, Jason's life took an unexpected turn when he saved a dying pregnant wolf, unknowingly beginning a deep bond with the untamed world. Months later, he witnessed something incredible, something that would forever change his understanding of nature. As the wolf pack returned, a powerful lesson in loyalty, survival, and respect unfolded before him. This is not just the story of a man and a wolf, but of an extraordinary journey that teaches the importance of letting go, understanding the wild, and finding peace in the most unlikely of friendships. It was a chilly evening when Jason, a nature lover and solitary hiker, found himself deep in the heart of the forest. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and the silence was only broken by the crunch of leaves underfoot. He had taken the trail many times before, but today, something felt different. A sense of unease lingered in the air, like nature was quietly holding its breath. As he ventured further, he spotted movement near the base of an old oak tree. It wasn't the usual deer or rabbit he expected. A pregnant wolf lay there, her fur matted with dirt, her breathing shallow and labored. Jason's heart skipped a beat. Wolves were rare to see in these parts, and the sight of one so vulnerable made his stomach twist with concern. The wolf's amber eyes met his, filled with pain and desperation. She was too weak to stand, too exhausted to flee. Jason had encountered wildlife before. He'd helped injured birds, saved a fawn once, but nothing had prepared him for this. The wolf was on the verge of death, her body frail and worn, and she was pregnant. For a long moment, Jason just stood there, torn between the instinct to keep his distance and the overwhelming urge to help. He knew that wolves were wild creatures, not meant to be tamed or touched by humans. Yet something inside him stirred, urging him to do something. He couldn't just leave her to suffer. With slow, deliberate steps, Jason knelt beside the wolf. Her eyes flickered in recognition as he carefully placed his hand on her back. The warmth of her body against his palm sent a shiver down his spine. She flinched at the touch, but Jason didn't pull away. He whispered softly, "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." For what seemed like an eternity, he sat with her, unsure of how to proceed. Finally, after a deep breath, he decided. He would bring her home. The road ahead would be uncertain, but he wasn't going to abandon her now. Jason carefully lifted the weak wolf into his arms, her weight heavier than he expected. Together, they began the journey back to his cabin, a strange bond already beginning to form between them. The journey back to Jason's cabin was slower than he had anticipated. The injured wolf was heavy in his arms, her body trembling from exhaustion. As he walked through the dense woods, Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. The forest around him seemed to close in, and the cool breeze of dusk carried a hint of dread. He wasn't sure how much time the wolf had left. When they reached his cabin, Jason carefully laid the wolf on an old, cushioned mattress he had used for hiking in the past. Her breathing was ragged, and her fur was still matted with dirt. The weight of the situation settled on his shoulders. He'd never cared for a wild animal before, let alone one as powerful and unpredictable as a wolf. He knew this wouldn't be easy. Jason immediately set to work. He started by cleaning the wolf's wounds, using what little medical knowledge he had. The scratches on her side were deep, but they weren't life-threatening. It was the exhaustion that worried him most. She needed food, water, and rest. He offered her some water, but she refused to drink, her eyes still watching him with a wary caution. Jason sighed, unsure how to bridge the gap between them. He knew the wolf's natural instincts would make it hard for her to trust him, but he had no choice. If she was going to survive, she had to feel safe. As the night wore on, Jason stayed by her side, gently speaking to her in soothing tones. He wasn't sure if she understood, but he hoped she could feel the care behind his words. Slowly, the wolf's breathing evened out, though she remained unconscious. The hours passed, and Jason began to prepare himself for a long recovery. The wolf would need weeks, maybe even months, to heal. But for now, all he could do was wait and watch. He pulled a blanket over her, settled down on the floor beside her, and finally allowed himself to sleep. In the quiet of the night, Jason couldn't help but wonder what would happen if she did recover. Would she return to the wild? Would she ever trust him enough to stay? Only time would tell. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between Jason and the wolf grew stronger. At first, the wolf had been cautious, her eyes constantly alert, as if expecting him to turn on her. But gradually, she began to relax, allowing Jason to get closer without flinching. He continued to care for her with patience, cleaning her wounds, feeding her a diet of small, carefully prepared meats, and offering her water. She began to eat from his hands, though still with hesitance, and after several days, she started drinking. Her coat slowly started to regain its luster, the dull fur giving way to its natural shine. Jason named her Luna, as the moon had been bright in the sky the night he'd found her. One evening, while sitting beside her as she rested, Luna made a small, soft noise. Jason looked down, startled to see her head lifted just a little, her amber eyes meeting his. For the first time, there was no fear in them, only a quiet curiosity. It was as if she had finally accepted that he meant no harm. Jason smiled and whispered, "You're going to be okay." He knew she wasn't out of danger yet, but it felt like a victory. The connection between them was undeniable. He wasn't sure how long she would stay or what the future would bring, but he was certain of one thing. Luna was no longer just a wild animal to him. She was a companion. Weeks passed, and Luna's condition improved. She became more active, often stretching her legs and even attempting small runs around the cabin's yard. Jason watched with a mixture of pride and awe, knowing that her recovery was a testament to her resilience and his persistence. One chilly morning, Luna's behavior changed. She had always been wary of the forest, keeping close to the cabin and staying mostly indoors. But on this day, she lingered at the door, her eyes fixed on the forest beyond. Jason stood up from his chair, surprised. "What's out there?" he muttered to himself. Luna whined softly, a low sound that was almost like a plea. Then, without warning, she dashed out the door and into the woods. Jason hesitated, unsure whether to follow, but something told him he had to. He grabbed his jacket and ran after her, his breath misting in the cold air. He found her near the edge of the forest, standing in front of a cluster of trees. And there, hidden behind them, was a surprising sight. Another wolf. The two locked eyes, and Jason's heart skipped a beat. The wolf appeared strong and healthy, but there was a familiar, protective energy between the two animals. Luna stepped forward, nuzzling the newcomer affectionately. Jason stood still, trying to understand. It was then that the other wolf turned and met his gaze. For a moment, Jason felt as if he was being watched by an ancient force, a silent understanding that stretched beyond words. The other wolf turned and vanished into the forest, leaving Jason and Luna alone once again. Luna had changed. She wasn't just recovering physically, but emotionally as well. She no longer looked at Jason with uncertainty, but instead seemed to trust him completely. She followed him around the cabin, sat beside him during meals, and even allowed him to pet her more freely. Jason noticed something else, though. A quiet restlessness had begun to settle in Luna. She often stared out the window or paced the cabin, as if waiting for something. Jason had assumed that once she recovered, she would simply return to the wild. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play. One evening, while preparing dinner, Jason heard a distant howling in the woods. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, echoing through the trees. Luna's ears perked up at the sound, and she looked toward the door, her body tense. The howling stopped abruptly, but Luna remained on high alert, as if listening for something. Jason set down his knife and approached her cautiously. "It's okay, Luna," he said softly, but she didn't seem reassured. The next morning, Luna was gone. Jason's heart sank when he realized Luna was gone. He searched the cabin, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. Panic set in as he rushed outside, scanning the woods with frantic eyes. He couldn't imagine what had happened. Had she been taken by another animal? Or had she decided to return to the wild? The howl from the night before echoed in his mind. Jason knew the wolf pack was out there. Luna had heard them, and perhaps it was time for her to return to them. He felt a pang of loss, unsure if he should be happy for her newfound freedom or mournful for their bond that might be ending. For hours he searched the woods, calling out to her, but Luna didn't answer. Exhausted, Jason finally made his way back to the cabin, his heart heavy with uncertainty. Was it over? Had she truly left him behind? It had been 2 days since Luna disappeared, and Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He tried to continue with his life, but the emptiness of the cabin weighed on him. He spent his time working, keeping busy, but every night he lay awake wondering if Luna would return. Then, on the third night, as Jason sat by the fireplace, he heard a soft scratching at the door. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be? He rushed to the door and threw it open. There, standing in the moonlight, was Luna. She was different, stronger, more confident, but there was something else in her eyes, a quiet sadness that Jason couldn't quite place. She didn't approach immediately, but instead stood at a distance, watching him. Jason slowly stepped outside. His breath caught in his throat. Luna took a few cautious steps toward him, and then, unexpectedly, she nuzzled him gently. Jason knelt, his hands trembling as he touched her fur. "You're back," he whispered, relief flooding through him. Luna barked softly, and for the first time, Jason noticed something in her demeanor. She was no longer just a survivor, but a leader. He realized, with a mixture of awe and sadness, that she wasn't coming back just for him. She had returned to share something with him, something important. Over the next few days, Luna's behavior grew more intense. She spent long hours outside, pacing around the perimeter of the cabin, her ears always twitching at the slightest sound. Jason followed her as best he could, noticing the way she often stopped and looked toward the farthest point in the woods. It was as if she was waiting for something, or someone. One evening, while Jason was chopping wood, Luna's growl cut through the air. Her body stiffened, and she stared into the forest, her fur bristling. Jason dropped the axe, his pulse quickening. "What is it, Luna?" he asked, his voice steady despite the unease rising in him. The growl turned into a howl, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the trees. Jason's blood ran cold. He knew that sound. It was a warning. Without another thought, Jason grabbed his rifle and followed Luna into the woods. She moved quickly, her steps sure and steady, leading him deeper into the forest. As they neared the edge of a clearing, Jason stopped, his breath catching in his throat. There, in the distance, was a pack of wolves, watching them with unblinking eyes. Luna stepped forward, her posture strong and commanding. Jason stood still, unsure what to do. He was no longer just a man trying to help a wounded animal. He was in the presence of something wild, something untamed. And in that moment, he realized that Luna wasn't just an animal, she was part of something much greater. Luna approached the pack, her movements slow and deliberate. The leader of the pack, a massive, silver-grey wolf, stepped forward, meeting her in the center of the clearing. The two wolves circled each other, eyes locked, a silent conversation taking place between them. Jason watched, holding his breath. The pack watched them both, but there was no hostility in their eyes. It was as if Luna had returned to them, not just as a member of the pack, but as someone they had been waiting for. The silver-grey wolf nodded once, and Luna turned her head to look back at Jason. It was in that moment Jason understood. Luna hadn't left because she didn't care about him. She had left because she needed to return to her pack. She was a part of something much bigger than himself, something that he could never be a part of. Luna's eyes met his one last time, and then, with a soft nudge to the silver-grey wolf, she turned and joined the pack. Jason stayed frozen in the clearing, watching as the wolves vanished into the woods, leaving him behind. Jason returned to the cabin that night, his heart heavy with loss, but also with understanding. Luna had returned to where she truly belonged. The time they had shared was fleeting, but meaningful. He had saved her life, and in return, she had opened his eyes to the world beyond his own. The next few weeks were quiet. Jason kept to his routine, but the absence of Luna left a void in his life. He had come to accept that she was gone, and perhaps that was how it was meant to be. But something lingered in the back of his mind. The wolves hadn't just disappeared. They had left him a part of their world. One evening, while Jason sat by the fire, a soft sound reached his ears. He froze, listening. It was a howl, faint but unmistakable. Another howl followed it, then another. Jason stood up and walked to the door, looking into the night. There, in the distance, he saw them, Luna and the pack. They were watching him, standing together in the moonlight, their eyes glowing softly in the dark. Jason stepped outside, a small smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't over. The pack hadn't forgotten him, and neither had Luna. In her own way, she had come back, to show him that their bond would never truly break. Days passed, and Jason went about his life, with a quiet contentment settling over him. His connection with Luna and the wolves remained in his heart, a reminder of the untamed world that existed just beyond his cabin. It was one evening, while he was fixing a fence near his property, that he heard something strange, a rustling in the brush. Jason stood still, his instincts telling him something was different. Then, from behind a cluster of trees, a figure emerged. It wasn't a wolf, but a man, a rugged, bearded figure with wild eyes. Jason's heart raced. Who was this? Why was he here? "Who are you?" Jason called, trying to sound calm, though his pulse quickened. The stranger stopped, sizing him up. "I've been following the wolves," he said, his voice gruff. "I know you helped one of them. I need your help too." The stranger introduced himself as Elias, a hunter who had spent years tracking wolves. He claimed to have been researching the same pack Luna belonged to, fascinated by their behavior and intelligence. But Elias also had his own reasons for seeking Jason out. "I've been tracking these wolves for months," Elias explained, his eyes narrowing. "But there's something wrong. Something's changed in the pack. They've become aggressive, territorial." Jason felt a knot form in his stomach. Luna and the pack had always been wild, but they had never seemed dangerous. Elias, however, was insistent. "I need your help to understand them. You've already helped one. I need to know how." Jason wasn't sure what to think. He hadn't asked for this. But the thought of Luna in danger made his decision for him. "All right," he said. "I'll help, but we're doing this my way." For the next few days, Elias and Jason traveled deep into the forest, following the trails the wolves had left behind. Elias carried a map, marking where he believed the pack's territory was expanding. Jason's mind raced. Something wasn't right. The wolves had always respected their boundaries. Why had things changed? They reached a dense part of the forest, where the trees grew thick and the air felt heavy. Jason felt a chill run down his spine. It was here, he realized, that Luna and the pack spent most of their time. Luna had returned once, but the pack had not followed. What if Elias was right? What if something had gone wrong? Suddenly, there was a loud snap of a twig. Jason froze. Something was out there. The tension in the air grew thick as Jason and Elias crept further into the woods. The sounds of the forest faded into an eerie silence. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He was acutely aware of every movement around him. Then, a low growl echoed through the trees. Jason's breath hitched. It was unmistakable. Luna. The sound came again, closer this time. And then, from the shadows, she emerged. Luna stood tall, her fur bristling, her eyes fierce and alert. She was not alone. Behind her, the entire pack emerged from the forest, their bodies tense, eyes watching Jason and Elias with calculated intent. "Stay back," Jason warned Elias, his voice low. He could feel the wolves' unease. There was something different about them. Luna took a step forward, her eyes never leaving Jason. Slowly, she began to circle him, her posture protective. Luna circled Jason, her gaze intense and unwavering. The rest of the pack watched, their eyes glowing in the moonlight. Jason could feel the energy shifting around him. This was not a simple reunion. Something had changed, something deep in the pack's dynamics. Elias stepped forward cautiously, sensing the tension in the air. "We need to know what's happening," he said quietly, almost to himself. Jason hesitated. He had spent weeks caring for Luna and healing her wounds, but now, seeing the pack in their entirety, he realized something that made his chest tighten. He couldn't control them. Luna had her own place, her own purpose, and it was clear now, more than ever, that it wasn't tied to him. Luna stopped circling and moved to stand beside the pack's leader. The silver-grey wolf, the one she had greeted when she first returned, stepped forward. Jason's heart raced. The wolf's eyes were full of authority, yet there was no aggression, only a deep, knowing calm. Jason took a step back. The wolves, including Luna, had made their choice. They weren't the same creatures he had helped months ago. Their territory had grown, and their instincts had sharpened. Jason wasn't sure if they could ever coexist again. But he knew one thing. He had to leave them to their lives. He couldn't intervene. "I can't help you," Jason whispered, the words heavy with regret. The silence between Jason and the wolves stretched for what seemed like an eternity. Luna's amber eyes locked with his, and for a moment Jason swore he could see recognition in them, perhaps even gratitude. The silver-grey wolf stood strong beside her, his gaze steady and calm. Jason's heart was torn. He had cared for Luna, protected her when she was vulnerable, and in return she had taught him to appreciate the wild. But now he could sense the pack's power, their purpose. They were no longer just survivors. They were a force of nature, and Jason was just a visitor in their world. Without warning, the silver-grey wolf turned, and Luna followed, her gaze lingering on Jason for one final moment. The pack moved as one, silently retreating into the woods, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. Jason watched them go, feeling a profound sadness, but also a sense of peace. He had done what he could. Now it was time for them to live as they were meant to. Elias stood next to him, watching the wolves vanish into the trees. "So, what now?" he asked quietly. Jason took a deep breath. "Now we leave them in peace." The days that followed were some of the loneliest Jason had ever known. The forest, once full of life and purpose, now felt empty without Luna's presence. The wolves had left, and though Jason knew it was the right thing, he couldn't help but feel the absence of their energy. Elias, too, seemed changed. The search for answers had led him deep into the forest, but now even he had realized that the wild didn't bend to human expectations. The wolves would no longer be studied, no longer controlled. They would remain free. For Jason, there was a bittersweet sense of finality. He went about his daily routines, but everything felt quieter. The cabin, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a place of solitude. As the days turned to weeks, Jason realized he was no longer the same person he had been when he first found Luna. The experience had opened his eyes to the untamed beauty of the world, and to the delicate balance of life in the wild. Spring arrived, and with it came a new energy. The forest was alive again, as the birds chirped and the leaves began to bud. Jason spent more time outside, walking the trails, breathing in the fresh air, and reflecting on everything he had learned. One afternoon, as he sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the sunset, he heard a familiar sound, a soft, distant howl. His heart skipped a beat. It was a wolf's call, Luna. Jason stood, looking toward the edge of the forest where the sound had come from. He hadn't seen any sign of her for months, but hearing that howl filled him with a sense of hope. Maybe the pack had returned to their old territory, Or perhaps they were simply passing through. But as the howl echoed again, Jason felt something else. A new understanding. He wasn't meant to control the wild. He was meant to witness it. He was a part of it, but he wasn't the center of it. A few days later, Jason ventured deeper into the woods, drawn by an unfamiliar pull. He had a sense that something was waiting for him, something important. The trees were thick, and the air smelled of pine and earth. He walked for hours, his mind lost in thought, until he finally reached a clearing. There, standing in the middle, was Luna. She wasn't alone. The silver-grey wolf was by her side, and surrounding them were the rest of the pack. They stood tall, their eyes shining in the fading light of the day. For a moment, Jason stood still, unsure of what to do. Luna's gaze met his, and this time there was no distance between them. No hesitation. She stepped forward, followed by the pack, and stopped just in front of Jason. He could feel the weight of their presence, the quiet power of the wolves surrounding him. Then, something extraordinary happened. The silver-grey wolf, the leader of the pack, stepped forward and nodded toward Jason as if giving him a silent blessing. Luna too moved closer and nuzzled his hand in a gentle, affectionate gesture. Jason's heart swelled. This wasn't a goodbye. It was a message. The wild was alive, and it had a place for him, just as it had for Luna. As the pack slowly disappeared back into the forest, Jason stood in the clearing, his emotions swirling. He had spent so much time trying to protect and understand Luna, but now he realized something important. He didn't need to be their protector. The wolves were strong on their own, just as the forest was strong. Jason's role was simply to witness, to understand, and to respect the wild. He didn't need to own it or change it. He just had to be a part of it. He returned to his cabin, the image of Luna's amber eyes still fresh in his mind. As the days passed, he found peace in the knowledge that he had helped her when she needed him most. He had been a bridge between two worlds, and now he would continue on his own path, one that was intertwined with the wild, but no longer defined by it. The wolves would go on with their lives, and so would Jason. But he knew, deep down, that they would always share a connection, a bond forged in the heart of the forest. The months passed, and Jason's connection with the wilderness deepened. His once solitary life had evolved. He spent his days exploring the forest, learning its rhythms, its mysteries, and its endless beauty. The howls of the wolves, though infrequent, still echoed through the night, a reminder that they were out there, thriving in the wild. Elias the hunter had returned to his own life, content with the knowledge that the wolves were as elusive as they were majestic. He had become an ally in Jason's quiet mission to preserve the balance of nature around him. But now, Jason felt more alone than ever in his mission to honor the wolves' spirit. One morning, as he walked along the edge of the forest, Jason stumbled upon something that would change everything. A wolf pup, small, weak, and alone, was lying near a stream. Jason's heart leaped. The pup's fur was matted, its breathing shallow. Something was terribly wrong. Jason knelt beside the pup, his hand trembling as he gently touched its fur. It was clear that the animal was in distress, its tiny body shaking with fever. Jason felt the weight of responsibility settle in his chest. He knew that the wolves had been left to live in the wild, but this little one needed help. "Hang on," Jason whispered, feeling a deep pull to care for it. The pup's eyes fluttered open, weak and unfocused, but it seemed to recognize Jason's presence. Slowly, Jason picked up the pup and carried it back to the cabin. For days, he tended to the pup's wounds, feeding it and keeping it warm. Slowly but surely, the pup began to recover. Jason named it Ash, after the color of its fur, and with each passing day, Ash grew stronger. Ash's strength grew, and so did the bond between Jason and the pup. It was clear that Ash had no family to return to. Though Jason knew it wasn't ideal, he began to feel a sense of duty. Ash wasn't just a reminder of the wild. It was his responsibility now, the one creature he could protect and care for without fear of the wild reclaiming it. As Ash grew, Jason began to notice something curious. Despite being raised in the cabin, Ash's instincts were sharp. The pup was still wild at heart. His ears always perked at the sounds of birds. His eyes tracked every movement in the forest. It was as if Ash's wild spirit hadn't been lost at all. One cold winter evening, as Jason sat near the fire with Ash, curled up at his feet, a soft, familiar howl echoed through the trees. Luna's voice rang out, and for a moment, Jason's heart stopped. Ash stirred, his ears perking up at the sound. Jason stood, his pulse quickening. He knew what this meant. Luna and the pack had returned. He stepped outside and gazed into the dark woods. He saw the faint silhouettes of wolves emerging from the forest, their eyes glowing in the pale moonlight. Luna stood at the front, her posture strong and confident, and beside her was the silver-grey wolf. Jason's breath caught in his throat. They had come for Ash. Luna approached Jason slowly, her eyes meeting his. There was no hostility, no aggression. There was only understanding, an understanding that she had returned to reclaim what belonged to the wild. Jason felt the weight of the moment. Ash had become part of his life, but he knew that this was a decision beyond him. Ash was a wolf, not a pet. The pack had returned, and now the pup would have to join them. Luna nudged Ash gently, coaxing him to join her. The little wolf pup hesitated, looking up at Jason with eyes full of confusion and longing. Jason's heart broke, but he knew what had to be done. "Go," Jason whispered, his voice barely a breath. "It's your home." Ash looked back at him once more before running to join the pack. Jason stood silently, watching as the wolves disappeared into the forest, their forms swallowed by the night. Jason spent the next several days in solitude, reflecting on the loss of Ash and the bittersweet realization that he had done the right thing. The forest felt quieter, but Jason knew the wolves had found their way again. They were where they belonged. Life in the cabin became simpler, and Jason found peace in the rhythm of the wilderness. His relationship with the land grew stronger, and he learned to listen more closely to its needs, its signs, its moods. It wasn't just about saving individual creatures, it was about preserving the harmony of the entire ecosystem. He knew now that the wild had a place for him, but it also had a place for Ash, and Luna, and the entire pack. Jason would no longer try to impose himself on them. He would simply be a witness. One evening, as Jason ventured out to gather firewood, a storm rolled in quickly. The wind howled through the trees, and the temperature dropped sharply. Jason knew he needed to return to the cabin before the storm became too dangerous, but as he hurried back, he noticed something strange. A figure emerged from the woods, a wolf, but it wasn't one Jason recognized. This wolf was smaller, its fur ragged and dirty. It looked weak, struggling to stay upright. Jason's heart went out to the creature. He approached cautiously, keeping his distance. The wolf's eyes were clouded with pain, and its breath came in shallow gasps. Without hesitation, Jason gently coaxed the wolf toward the cabin, where he could tend to it. As he worked to heal the creature's wounds, Jason realized that this was a reminder. The wild was unpredictable. It was both beautiful and dangerous. But no matter how much he cared for it, he could never tame it. Weeks passed, and the wolf Jason had taken in healed. He called it Ember, after the warmth of the fire that had saved it. But Ember's time with Jason was short-lived. One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, Ember simply disappeared into the woods. Jason understood. The wild had called to Ember, as it had to Ash, and so the cycle continued. Jason no longer viewed the wolves as a part of his world that needed saving. They were creatures of the forest, and he was simply a steward of the land. He had learned his place in the natural world, and though it was bittersweet, it was also deeply fulfilling. Life continued peacefully for Jason in the cabin. He had come to terms with his role in the forest. His days were filled with quiet work and long walks, always aware of the wolves nearby. He often heard their distant howls in the night, a reminder of the connection they shared. One day, a familiar face appeared on the horizon. Elias. He had returned, but this time it wasn't to track the wolves. Elias had come to learn, to understand more about the land, and to see how Jason had changed. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Elias admitted, sitting with Jason by the fire. "The wolves are not to be controlled. They're a part of something bigger." Jason nodded. "We all are. They live in harmony with the wild, just as we should." Jason's life continued in the quiet rhythm of the seasons, his bond with the wilderness growing ever stronger. He would never forget the wolves, their power, their grace, and their wildness. In the years that followed, Jason saw many more wolves pass through the forest, their howls echoing in the night. But he had learned one important lesson. The wild doesn't need to be saved. It needs to be respected, observed, and allowed to thrive. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the sun dip behind the trees, Jason heard a familiar sound, a wolf's call. It was Luna's voice, and though she was distant, Jason knew that the connection they shared would last forever. Years passed in the quiet wilderness. Jason's days had become a familiar routine, and the forest felt like home. The wolves remained in the area, always just out of sight, yet present in the sounds of the night. Jason would often hear their howls at dawn, like whispers on the wind, a constant reminder of the connection he had forged with the wild. One evening, as Jason sat near the edge of the woods, he spotted something that took him by surprise. A new wolf was standing just beyond the tree line. It was young, with fur that glistened in the setting sun, its amber eyes bright and full of life. Jason smiled softly. He had seen many wolves pass through this land, but this one felt different. It was as if the next chapter in the pack's journey was beginning right before his eyes. Over the following weeks, Jason continued to observe the young wolf. He noticed it was often alone, a solitary figure wandering the forest, seemingly searching for something. Jason recognized that the wolf had not yet found its place in the world. It reminded him of himself, back when he first arrived at the cabin, uncertain of his purpose. But over time, through his connection with the wolves and the land, he had discovered what he was meant to do. The forest had become his sanctuary, and the wild his teacher. Jason knew he had a role to play in this new chapter, even if it was just as a quiet observer. One crisp evening, Jason ventured deeper into the woods, drawn by an inexplicable sense of urgency. As he walked, he began to hear the soft whispers of the pack. It was Luna's voice, calling to him from a distance. Jason's heart quickened as he followed the sound, moving through the trees until he reached a clearing. There, standing in the center of the clearing, was Luna, with the silver-grey wolf by her side. They were waiting for him. As Jason approached, Luna stepped forward, her amber eyes steady. The silver-grey wolf glanced at Jason, then turned back to Luna. It was clear that something important was about to unfold. Jason knelt, understanding that this was a rare moment, one of great significance. Luna and the silver-grey wolf stood before Jason, and for the first time in a long while, Jason felt the weight of their presence. The pack had thrived, but now the time had come for something new. Luna stepped forward and nudged the silver-grey wolf. Jason watched in awe as the older wolf slowly approached the young wolf who had been wandering the woods. The young wolf had appeared in the distance for months, but now it stepped into the clearing as if it had known all along that this moment would come. The young wolf took its place next to the silver-grey wolf, a silent acknowledgement of the legacy that had been passed down. Jason understood then. This was the passing of the torch. The pack was evolving, and a new leader was emerging. The wild would continue to move forward, always growing, always changing. As time went on, Jason's role in the forest grew more and more defined. He no longer sought to change the wild. Instead, he embraced it, allowing it to shape him. The wolves had taught him the most important lesson of all, that the wild was not something to be controlled. It was something to be respected, nurtured, and allowed to flourish. One day, as Jason stood on a hill overlooking the forest, he watched the pack moving through the trees. The young wolf, now stronger and more confident, led the group, with Luna and the silver-grey wolf trailing close behind. Jason smiled softly. He realized that he had done his part. He had protected them when they needed him most, and now it was time to step back. The seasons shifted, and Jason felt a deep sense of contentment. The wolves remained in the area, but they no longer needed him. The balance had been restored. They had found their place in the wild, just as he had found his. Life at the cabin continued, but Jason had begun to understand that he was no longer an outsider. He was part of the land, part of the wilderness. His connection with the wolves was a bond that could never be broken, no matter how far they roamed. One evening, as Jason sat by the fire, he thought back to the moment when he had first discovered Luna in the woods. It seemed like a lifetime ago. But in that moment, he knew that everything had come full circle. Jason's time in the forest was drawing to a close. He had spent years learning from the wild, and the wolves had become more than just creatures of the forest. They had become symbols of resilience, strength, and grace. They had taught him to embrace the wild within himself, to honor the balance that existed in nature. One final time, Jason walked into the heart of the forest, where the wolves had once gathered. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the soft whispers of the trees seemed to call to him. He paused for a moment, listening to the distant howls of the pack. Jason knew it was time to let go. The wolves had their own journey to follow, and so did he. On the last day of autumn, Jason made his way to the clearing where he had first met Luna. The pack had long since moved on, but Jason felt their presence all around him. He sat quietly, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath him, the wind in his hair. It was then that he heard the familiar sound of a wolf's call. Luna, the silver-grey wolf. They were calling to him one last time, a soft, haunting melody that seemed to echo through the ages. Jason closed his eyes, feeling the wind on his face, and in that moment, he knew that he would never be alone. The wild was a part of him, and he was a part of it. The wolves had come into his life when he needed them most, and now they had left him with a legacy of understanding, respect, and love for the natural world. Years passed, and the world around Jason continued to change. But the forest remained timeless, its beauty enduring through the seasons. Jason lived out his days in the cabin, always connected to the wild, always remembering the wolves that had shaped his life. Though he never saw them again, he knew that the pack was out there, somewhere in the woods, and whenever he heard the call of a wolf in the distance, he smiled, knowing that their spirits were intertwined. Jason had learned that the wild was not a place to conquer, but a place to respect. It was a living, breathing entity, full of wonder and mystery, and it was a part of him, just as he was a part of it. As Jason grew older, he spent more time reflecting on his journey. The forest, once an unknown world, had become his home. And though he no longer saw the wolves, he knew their legacy lived on in the land. One quiet morning, as Jason walked through the woods, he stopped at the edge of a clearing. The sun filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow on the earth below. It was here, in